Christ, I muttered to myself as the first flakes of snow started to fall. They gathered in fuzzy clumps over the windshield before my wipers cleared them away. I'd been waiting for 20 minutes now, in my sister's driveway. Had I chosen to wait inside with her, I'd have been dead by now thanks to her 2 gray cats. Cute little devils, but murder to my sinuses. Puffy eyes and a clogged up throat. That's just what I needed. Every Christmas, our family made the annual trip to my grandparents' cabin tucked away in the woods of Hope, Alaska, and I'd hoped to beat the heavy snowfall that was forecasted. Since my sister's license was suspended from a DUI, here I was, a hostage to time, with my finger tapping anxiously on the steering wheel. When my mother had asked me to be the one to grab my sister, I had honestly dreaded it from the start. It wasn't that we hated one another. We just weren't as close anymore. After decades of constant arguments and bitter disagreements, we became distant and our relationship fizzled. Yes, we were siblings, but it felt more accurate to call us the residue of what siblings once were. Finally, like the gates of Valhalla, her front door opened, and out she came. Her hair was forest green. The last time I'd seen her, it had been white. The time before that, it was violet. Got everything? I asked, as she clambered her way into the passenger seat. She responded, as she adjusted her glasses and stuffed a few bags in the back seat. And just like that, we were off. Hope was about a 30-minute drive, and it didn't take long for the awkward silence to inflate between us. It didn't help that the radio didn't work in my car, and that the broken auxiliary port made your music sound like it was having a seizure. By the time we reached the turnoff for Hope Highway, the road was turning into a thick white sheet. Thankfully, on Christmas Eve night, the long stretch to Hope's small community was quick and vacant. The cabin was tucked away in a fortress of trees 5 miles off the main road. As I made the turn, my sister cracked the window, pulled out a blunt, and lit it with her lighter. "Want a hit?" she asked. Snow crunched beneath us. "Not while I'm driving. It's a straight path. We're practically there already." She took a drag and blew it out the window. "I want to just focus on this. All right?" She huffed and pushed up her glasses. "If you're that worried, maybe slow down a bit then." There was the jab, a piece of bait to lure me into another fight. But I wasn't going to bite, not this time. She could live with us getting there faster. The drive was almost over, and soon I'd be in a warm living room with my feet up, a spiked eggnog in my hand and Bobby Helms' Jingle Bell Rock in the air. I could already hear Uncle Jed spouting off one of his crude jokes. "Why does Santa Claus have such a big dude?" my sister shrieked, jabbing a finger in my side and whipping my mind back to the windshield. The car had just finished winding around the thick trail. The large body of a reindeer stood in our path. Eyes wide open and blank, it didn't move as the high beams found it. Snapped into a panic, I twisted the wheels in a desperate swerve. The car veered greasily to the side in a fine spray of slosh. The reindeer, also known as a caribou, remained still, even as the bumper soared inches from its nose. We came to a crunching halt off the main path. "Jesus," I sighed, blessed with relief. "Did we hit it?" "No," my sister said, leaning out the window to check, while exhaling another plume of smoke. I wound the steering wheel back around and pressed on the gas. The wheels shrilled in place, kicking up globs of sleet but not moving an inch. "Perfect," I moaned and unfolded myself from the seat to check it out. The 2 front tires were caked in black slush and practically swallowed in a mound of snow. I kicked at it, trying to clear off the icy debris from the treads and beneath the wheel well. When that tired me out, I resorted to scraping it off with my fingers. "Screw off, Prancer," I heard my sister call toward the dark silhouette of the reindeer, its antlers like gnarled fingers reaching for the treetops. Then she made a sort of startled yip, followed by a "what the fuck?" I looked up from the scrim of snow. The reindeer was now standing tall on both of its hind legs. It looked strange, like a silly caricature you'd see in a kid's book. But out there, in the silence of the woods, it was a creepy image. The way its vague shape stood on just two legs held an almost human-like balance. For whatever reason, I realized then it didn't have a tail. Its muscular neck craned to the side and let out an ululating scream. A miserable squeal of metal grinding against metal. My legs were ice sculptures, cementing me to the spot as the shriek quieted to a succession of wet grunts. The reindeer dropped down to its original posture and stomped heavily. Puffs of white vapor and strings of snot vented from its nostrils. I was no hunter, but it didn't take a lot to tell when a pissed-off animal was about to charge. I leaped for the driver's seat, pulled the door open, and slammed it shut just as the muffled thud of hooves reached me. Antlers scraped the door as its large body practically flew over the patch I had just been standing in. Fast, very fast. My sister screamed as the large bulk of its frame wound back around and charged again, this time shattering the headlights and submerging us in darkness. "Just go already," my sister hollered in my ear. "I'm trying." "God damn it," I hissed. The wheels continued to spin helplessly. We were trapped. The creature charged again, this time nailing the window. A cobweb of cracks bloomed near my sister's head. I searched for anything, literally anything, that I could use as a weapon. I was never really a gun enthusiast, but at that moment I'd have shaved my head and joined the secular monks if it meant having a Glock in my hand right then and there. After rattling the car once more, the reindeer finally appeared to lose interest and disappeared amidst the cluster of trees. Granted some time to breathe and think, we phoned our dad and told him about the situation. He was going to come down in his pickup and get us unstuck and out of this mess. I looked over at my sister, who was taking long and steady breaths between her fingers. "Are you all right?" I asked. "What do you think?" she grumbled. "I told you to slow down." Another jab, and this time I wasn't going to have it. "You want to be useful?" I yelled. "Get out there and push." "No? Then shut the hell up. I don't need it right now." She said nothing else, and neither did I, returning once again to the pocket of silence that our relationship succumbed to. The sooner Dad's headlights peaked in the distance, the better. Suddenly, she rolled the window down. "What are you doing?" I asked. "SSSH." She pursed her lips. "Just listen." Humoring her, I waited, and sure enough, the sound reached me too. The quiet voice of a little girl coming from outside. "Somebody," it whimpered, "I'm lost. Please help me. I'm lost." My sister unlocked the door and motioned to open it. I grabbed her wrist. "What are you doing?" she snapped. "There's someone out there. Just wait a second. It's weird, isn't it?" The voice continued to whine, choking between sobs and pleading for someone, anyone, to help her. I didn't like the way it sounded. The same lasting drawl between words, the same weeping sounds, like someone was hitting repeat on a speaker. Something wasn't right, and my instincts were hoisting red flags left and right. Then my sister looked at me, and her expression warped into shock. She flung back, pinning both shoulders against the interior. Things that sounded like words bubbled up but didn't quite make it out of her throat. I turned and saw what was looking at me. It had the face of a man, surrounded by the mottled fur of a caribou's body. The skin was a mummified brown color, wound tightly around its long skull like old, crinkled leather. Snowflakes landed upon its wide, expressionless eyes and melted into the dark membranes of its pupils. It circled the car, bobbing its antlers and fogging up the windows as it peered inside. My heart shook the walls of my throat. I locked eyes with my sister, unable to say anything behind the sheer disbelief. I should have grabbed my phone, snapped a photo, recorded a video, anything. but my thoughts were jangled. It then let out that same horrible scream, but I didn't see its tight, contorted lips open. The sound was coming from its neck. Small, fleshy orifices, flapping open like mouths, were converting the high-pitched shrill into the mimicked cry of a little girl. "Help me! I'm lost! Help me!" Headlights glazed the area. My father's pickup came into view, paving its way down the path. The reindeer, or whatever the fuck it was, ran off, vanishing once again into the snow-covered thicket. Nobody believed us. Why would they? If anybody had told me that story, I would have assumed they were hopped up on some crazy psychedelic. But the reality of what I saw was cold, and it's something I still to this day can't fully swallow. Instead of sleeping that night, my sister and I did some research that led us to the myth of skinwalkers. Beings of some sort capable of mimicking voices and disguising themselves as animals to lure people into the woods. After reading other accounts, there wasn't a doubt in my mind what we'd witnessed out there. Every so often that night, I'd stare out the window and eye the yard, wondering if I'd see that leathery face watching from the tree line. Neither I nor my sister ever made that trip again, much to the frustration of my family. But there was a silver lining. She and I have never been closer. The story credit, Michael Paige. Christmas has always been a hard time for me. Childhood memories of bickering relatives, drunken tirades, and hostile dinner conversations made me wince at the mere mention of the holiday. In the Christmas of 1989, I broke my collarbone on my new toboggan. In the Christmas of 1997, my brother drove the family car into a lamppost. And in the Christmas of 2000, my grandmother set the kitchen ablaze while attempting to cook a turkey. But it wasn't until the Christmas of 2008 that a real tragedy occurred. Jennifer and I met in the fall of 2002, engaged in the winter of 2004, and married in the summer of 2006. She gave birth to our son, Noah, in the spring of 2008. This was our first Christmas together as a family. It was a beautiful new model home in a quiet neighborhood in a peaceful little town. It was just a few days before Christmas when he broke in. I was staying late at the office before locking up for the holidays. He didn't take anything. He didn't move a single thing out of place. He just walked upstairs and went after her. The police called it the most senseless and animalistic act they had ever seen. And somehow, with her blood painting the walls, they still never managed to find the monster who did it. And I would never know why it happened. This year was going to be a new start for us. Despite the Scrooge-like demeanor I developed every year at this time, Noah loved Christmas. At almost 8 years old, he didn't have much to say. But everything he did say had to do with stories of Santa, elves, and reindeer. The little scoundrel was a better sleuth than he was a conversationalist. Last year, he managed to find his Christmas presents behind my tool bench in the garage. But this year, his presents were going into the attic where I knew he couldn't get to them. The mid-century home we purchased after Jennifer's passing had much older, antiquated attic stairs than our old home did. I had just finished packing the Christmas presents when in that dusty old attic when I realized it was time for his school bus to be dropping him off. As I pushed the heavy attic staircase up, I had a smirk of satisfaction. That child was not making his way up those steps. It was December 11th, Christmas Day was still 2 weeks away. My parents weren't arriving until the 18th. The holiday shopping was done, and school was now out until January. So Noah and I were going to have a few days of holiday bonding all to ourselves. This might have been the first Christmas in many years that I would truly get to enjoy. 5 nights ago, Noah stayed up a little later watching holiday specials on the television. He went to sleep around 8:30 and I went to bed shortly thereafter. It wasn't until 11 o'clock when I first heard those light footsteps scattering across the hall. I suddenly became alert as the footsteps stopped at my door. I sat up as the door slowly began to creak open. It was Noah. I was put at ease at the sight of him, but I was a little alarmed that he was up this late. He never stayed up past 9 o'clock, let alone wandered over to my room at this time. Noah, what are you doing out of bed this late? Dad, do you believe in Santa Claus? What? Do you? I was taken a little off guard by the question, but I decided to put his mind at ease. Yes, of course, I believe in Santa Claus. Why do you ask? Okay, that's good because he needs to know that we believe in him. I know, Noah. Now go back to bed. He smiled before closing the door. I heard his footsteps scattering back down the hall to his bedroom as I quickly drifted off to sleep. For nights ago, Noah and I were making Christmas cards for the relatives who would be arriving in the following days. We had construction paper, glitter, scissors, and glue. It was quite a messy scene, but I thought he deserved to have a little fun on his first day of vacation. After finishing up the cards, I began to gather them all up and look them over with Noah. There's one for Grandpa and Grandma and one for Uncle John, and I paused at the sight of a card addressed to no one in the family. Who is this card for, Noah? It's for Santa Claus. He would be really happy if we made him a card. 2. I smirked at Noah's thoughtfulness and added it to the pile. Later that night, I was awoken by a crashing noise. Suddenly, I heard the footsteps sputtering towards my room again with more urgency. Noah, this is the second night in a row. You still believe in Santa, right? Yes. I already told you that yesterday. Okay, I don't think Santa knows that. But thanks. Noah, what was that crashing noise I just heard? Noah shrugged his shoulders in ignorance and scurried back to his bedroom. I was too tired to argue with him. I was probably just imagining it. I drifted back to sleep. 3 nights ago, I was sitting in front of the television watching a football game while Noah was drawing with his crayons beside me. During breaks, I became increasingly curious as to what he was drawing. When he left the room, I picked it up and realized it wasn't a drawing. It was a list. Hey, Noah, is this your list to Santa Claus? Yeah. Santa told me I have to write him one. Do you think you can mail it to him in time? No, I can just leave it here. And he knows what I want because he's magic. I nodded at his flawless logic and handed it back to him. Later that night, I heard the scurrying of footsteps across the hall again. I was growing impatient with Noah's sleep cycle, but I was still awake reading at this time anyway. But he didn't come into my room that night. He just stood in front of the door for a moment and ran back to his room. 2 nights ago, I decided to sit down with Noah and ask him about his late-night wandering. He suddenly became nervous when asked, but he finally uttered that he was waiting for Santa to come with his sleigh and reindeer. I couldn't help but smile at this. Santa won't be coming until Christmas though, Noah. We've got a few more days to wait. He seemingly brushed my statement off and made an odd request. Can we leave him some milk and cookies for when he gets hungry? I wasn't going to argue with him. I'd just make him a deal. All right, but if we do, you have to promise to stay in your bed after bedtime. Okay. He nodded excitedly, but he didn't seem as happy about Santa's arrival as he did a few days ago. I guessed that he was getting burnt out from waiting so long. Later that night, the scurrying of footsteps began again. At first, they were faint, but then they headed straight to my room. I was more than a little upset at this point as my door opened. Noah, I thought I told you to stay in bed. He came and ate them, Dad. What? The milk and cookies. Santa came. I marched downstairs and had to admit I was surprised to see the milk and cookies gone. But this wasn't a difficult trick to pull off either. I was done with this game. Noah, Santa isn't coming until next week. And if you keep making up stories and getting out of bed, he's not coming at all. Do you understand? Noah's face turned to tears as he ran back up to his room and shut the door. I didn't want to be so mean, But there was only so much foolishness I could take at this time. Last night, things got very weird. Noah did not speak to me for most of the day. I finally apologized and told him just to stop making up stories. He seemed to be focusing elsewhere though. I didn't like the disrespectful attitude he was developing. Would you like to tell the truth about who ate the milk and cookies last night? He just pouted at me with an angry look. He ran back to his room and came back with a folded piece of construction paper. I thought this was his apology. That was until he spoke. This is a card from Santa. He told me to give this to you. I finally lost it. I took the card and crumpled it up without even bothering to read it. I threw it into the trash bin right in front of Noah. Noah, I don't know what's gotten into you, but Christmas is going to be canceled if you don't stop with these stupid little games. What do you want from me? I want my mom and dad to be back together. He once again rushed off to his room in tears. I felt guilty for managing to make him cry twice in 2 days. We never really talked about his mother. He had every right to be upset now that he was older and was beginning to understand her absence. I let him cool down for a while. I decided to let him sleep in my room both to comfort him and to keep an eye on him. It wasn't until 11 o'clock last night that he once again woke up. Dad, it's time. I was angry at being awoken at this hour again, but decided to be patient with Noah. Time for what, Noah? Santa has a surprise waiting for us downstairs. I was beginning to get a little nervous at Noah's delusions, but I finally decided to play along. Noah dragged me downstairs and into the living room. When I saw it for myself, I quickly became scared for a different reason altogether. The tree was lit up and all the presents from the attic were laid around the tree. Noah, how did you get all these down here? I didn't do it, Dad. Santa did. The hairs on my back began to stand on end. There was no way Noah could have lifted all these gifts or even gotten into the attic to find them. And how did Santa get into the attic to get them? Noah turned to me and meekly replied, "He's been living up there all week, Dad. He made me promise to keep it a secret." My jaw dropped as I tried to remain cool. Is Santa still in the house? Noah paused for a moment before answering. No, he said he had to leave after you found your surprise. And after you read his letter, my breathing became heavy as I started to panic in fear. I rushed across the house towards the wastebasket. I pulled out the crumpled letter I had thrown there earlier and opened it. The front of the card was written in eloquent handwriting. All you want for Christmas. I slowly opened the inside of the letter. I almost burst into tears at the sight of it. It was a picture of Jennifer and me, taken days before her death. Written in blood across the picture was, "Together again." Soon, my hands were shaking, couldn't even move. He was back, and he was going to finish what he started. On the back of the card, there was no blood. There was no ominous message. Just one simple little line. Ho, ho, ho. The story credit. Nate J. 82. The alarm was horribly loud in his left ear, a persistent high-pitched beep forcing him from his dreamless, alcohol-soaked slumber into a hangover-heavy wakefulness. Jim groaned, rolling away from the insistent machine and negligently silencing it with a lucky swipe of his arm. His head felt thick and fuzzy, his tongue dry and his stomach on the verge of rebellion. Jim opened his eyes and peered at the sliver of cold morning light showing through the curtains as half-recalled memories danced across his mind. A crowd of his friends in the pub. Reindeer jumpers and a sexy elf serving behind the bar. Oh God, this Christmas morning. Wild panic stabbed through him and he turned to his side. Sandra was missing. The empty space beside him was cold. She'd been gone a while. It had been his turn last night. He remembered that clearly. He'd made her the promise as he'd headed out. Wrapping his scarf around his neck, he'd step to the door, giving her a smile and saying that, of course, he wouldn't forget. How could he? Christmas Eve was the most vitally important night of the year. A basic trip out with friends wouldn't change that. But they'd had a couple of drinks. Then Harry had suggested a couple more. He'd barely realized he'd had so much until he stood up to head home and almost fallen over. They'd sung some songs on the way back, passed each other drunken warnings about not forgetting to put out the carrots and whiskey, and he'd stumbled in fully intending to do so. But then his memory was a blank. Did I put them out? What if he'd forgotten? Sandra was missing. Ripping the duvet off, he clambered out of bed and hurried to check on Owen. The kid was sleeping soundly, which, considering it was Christmas, was unusual. He must finally be growing up, which at the age of 8 was well overdue. In years past, he'd bounded out of bed at the crack of dawn, thrilled with the excitement of presents and determined to make every second of the day a test of his parents' patience. Jim's heart began to calm its manic pounding at the sight of his son. He hadn't been taken. He sagged against the door frame for a moment, recovering his composure and trying to ignore the throbbing headache rattling his skull. Slowly, he closed the door and stepped back into the hall, enjoying the flood of relief which momentarily washed away some of the guilt. Sandra was in the kitchen, huddled in her fluffy white dressing gown and nursing a cup of coffee. She looked terrible, pale and haunted. Her dark hair hung lankly around her shoulders and her eyes stared unseeing at a point far away. "Morning, hun," he ventured tentatively, reaching for the kettle. "Merry Christmas?" Her glazed eyes moved to his, her expression bleak. "Merry Christmas? That's what you say to me? I'm sorry, honey. I'm so sorry." He hesitated, torn between wanting to fill the kettle and not wanting to seem insincere. He shuffled his feet. "You're sorry," she repeated flatly, turning back to her coffee. "You have no idea what I went through. I woke up, you were there, snoring away in your clothes." She gave him an accusing, angry glare. "Good thing I decided to check that you'd done what you said you'd do, wasn't it?" "Yes," he said meekly, looking down at his feet and feeling thoroughly miserable. "But you hadn't." "No, what else was there to say?" "Jesus, Jim, how could you be so reckless?" It would be no excuse to say he had been drunk. No excuse that it was Christmas Eve and he'd been with the friends he only got to see once a year. It wouldn't help to remind her that she could have just as easily put out the whiskey and carrots, that there was no reason it had to be him every damn time. No reason why she was allowed to shirk the responsibility year after year, just so that she had a reason to tell him not to be out late. That is, besides her jealousy that he had friends that weren't her. He settled on just saying he was sorry again and turning away to fill the kettle. To his relief, she said nothing more about it. "So, how's it look out there? You catch the news yet?" She sighed, a resigned, miserable sigh. "I didn't have to. There's a news crew outside the Thompsons. Looks like they forgot." Jim turned, the kettle forgotten. The Thompsons weren't really friends of theirs, but they were decent people. They got together every now and then for a drink to discuss their kids or the school, that kind of thing. To think that they were gone, taken by the demon for the crime of forgetting to placate its bizarre demands, was horrifying. "Jesus," he breathed. "Could have been us," Sandra said. It wasn't accusatory, just factual. Her face was that of a person who'd just been pulled back from the edge of a cliff. Ashen and wan, her eyes wide and staring as though she could see her narrowly avoided fate playing out before her. He crossed the kitchen and hugged her, feeling a new kind of guilt when she hugged him back tightly and sobbed into his t-shirt. They stood that way for a while, neither one moving, their minds playing out the horror of what could have been, until Owen came bouncing into the kitchen clutching the bag of presents he'd found at the end of his bed. "Mummy! Daddy! Father Christmas came." He enthused in that way only very small children can, dragging the sack over. For a second, Jim couldn't summon the parental good cheer he needed, struggling to put the near miss to the back of his mind and drag up his daddy at Christmas persona. In a way, though it pained him to admit it, he was looking forward to when they no longer had to pretend. When Owen would be old enough to finally learn the truth about the creature that clattered around the house on Christmas Eve, the being that parents across the world conspired to portray as a jolly present giver in order to avoid discussion of dark truths too terrible for young minds. The perfect, universal lie that sent kids running early to bed on the one night of the year that they were most vulnerable, and kept them in their rooms feigning sleep if they heard any strange sounds during the night. Normally it didn't bother him, but this morning, having come so close to disaster, it was harder than usual to put the necessary spin on the beast that had visited them in the night, especially when he'd spent so many hours wrapping up all the presents he now had to attribute to a thing that had very nearly murdered them all. "Wow, lucky you, honey," Sandra finally said with a convincingly excited gasp. "Go ahead and take your sack into the living room and we'll see what he—" Her eyes met Jim's and mouthed the words, "Get it together." Owen, oblivious, ran off happily, pulling his sack of presents behind him. Jim nodded and took a deep breath as Sandra followed their son into the living room. A few minutes later, he was standing by the window, staring at the crowd outside the Thompsons, making appropriately encouraging responses to his son's wild cries of happiness and exclamations of what he was going to do with his toys. The news crew was solemn, and behind them the police were taping off the doors and windows of the house. No ambulance had been called. There would be no bodies. There never were. The news was playing at a dim volume on the TV behind them, but snatches of the report were getting through to him, linking him to the horror outside in flashes of juxtaposition to the joy his son was experiencing inside. The contrast made him feel sick. Once again, the reporter said behind Jim, in that light but strained voice they always used to deliver these reports, the tension only noticeable by adults, "This Christmas has given us the highest number of visitors since records began. Some speculation has focused on our growing population for the figures, but it seems clear that a large proportion of visitors were from newly arrived migrant families. Whilst it is common knowledge that the visitation requirements do differ from country to country, some people just forget to change their Christmas traditions." "Daddy?" Owen asked chirpily from behind him. Jim turned to see that the boy was watching the TV with interest. "Yes, Owen? Why do some people go to visit Father Christmas and others don't?" Sandra caught his eye, giving an almost imperceptible shake of the head. He looked away, wondering if this might be the moment to let the child in on the horrible truth. Was that the responsible thing to do? "Well," he said, measuring his words, "if people don't put out their carrot and whiskey, then they get to go and visit Father Christmas. So it could happen to anyone. Why don't we go then? I'd like to visit. Can we go next year?" Jim looked at Sandra. She looked away. "But we don't need to go to see Father Christmas, Owen. He comes to us. That's why Mummy put out the whiskey and the carrot last night." He pointed to the little plate next to the Christmas tree and the shot glass next to it. The glass was empty, and Jim had absolutely no intention of using either the glass or the plate ever again. A goofy-looking stuffed snowman had fallen across the plate, no doubt knocked by the talons of the beast as it reached for the carrot. Jim shuddered to imagine it, delicately lifting the carrot off the ceramic without leaving a mark. "When did you do that, Mummy?" asked Owen, peering round at his mother over a pile of shredded wrapping paper. "Did you get to see Father Christmas?" Sandra gave a sickly smile that looked more like a grimace and shook her head. "No, honey. I just came downstairs last night and put a glass of whiskey next to the carrot your father put out." Jim's heart nearly stopped. He stared at her, wondering if that was meant to be some kind of joke. From somewhere far away he could hear his son babbling, but the words no longer made any sense. Sandra was watching Owen indulgently, shaking her head at something he'd said. "You didn't put out a carrot?" he managed to say, just about keeping his voice from rising into a hysterical shriek. She looked up, her face now wearing a similar expression to the one he imagined was on his. "What?" she said sharply, her eyes falling to the little plate and widening in sudden, awful realization. Jim's stomach tightened in a cold knot. Owen seemed to pick up on the sudden tension, his expression curdling like sour milk. He started to breathe in that heavy way, with his shoulders moving, that his parents both knew preceded a tantrum. Jim looked down, the pieces suddenly falling into place like a horrific nightmare jigsaw. The little stuffed snowman, his long, orange, stuffed nose across the white ceramic plate, his tired wife mistaking it for a carrot, putting out the whiskey and going back to bed. "Oh, dear God," he whispered, as a thick voice, deep with hatred and dripping with obscene desire, gurgled at them from within the mound of discarded wrapping paper. "Ho, ho, ho," it cackled. As the colorful wrappings exploded outward, Owen screamed. The story credit, Stephen D. Jackson. Subscribe for more horror stories every day.